Good afternoon, pilot teachers, and good afternoon, students.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Sit down. Okay, we were looking at chemical weathering and some of the features which are formed as a result of chemical weathering. We were concentrating mainly in the areas where there are carboniferous limestone and the karst scenery and the many distinctive features which are found on the karst scenery. We did 3 activities yesterday, and the 4th one was actually given for you to complete for your homework. We'll check on the activity, and then we will get one of the students to come up to explain and also to give the answer for the exercise you were supposed to complete for your homework. Okay, the activity was, you were supposed to make a sketch drawing of the limestone pavement, and from that sketch drawing, you were supposed to label the ridges of the limestone as clines and the gaps in between those ridges as grikes. So from that sketch, we will have Trawen to come up to the front, and he is going to actually explain to us his sketch plus the labeling of the features for that particular activity. And the rest of you, you can double check and correct your work.
Chemical weathering takes place which the grikes are the gaps and the clines are the blocks.
If you've got to point to your diagram so that the students can really see where those grikes and the clines are.
Clines clines is the blocks and the grike is the gap.
Okay. You double check now. Thank you, Brendan, and the rest of us, we check. Check. The diagram you can see, he has actually constructed that prior to our lesson. He is shown here the gap which is between those blocks that have been left upstanding. That gap is referred to as the grike. And that gap is actually created as a result of chemical weathering. Process of solution or carbonation will eat away the rocks or the minerals which are found within this area here, resulting then in those joints or cracks being created. Okay, what is actually left standing then on the side are blocks or ridges. And those blocks or ridges are referred to as clines. And your construction should look similar to what he's got here, or otherwise your sketch should be according to what you have seen on the monitor for that work yesterday. Okay, we will move on. And grikes and clines are also features which are associated with weathering of limestone. So if we had to look at that photograph that you were supposed to sketch the information from, you have the limestone pavement, and you had to just select perhaps 1 or 2 examples there to show the grike, which is the gap between, and the clines then, which are the blocks that are left standing. Okay, if you had to do a little bit of explanation on those features, then your explanation would be, you have a limestone pavement. It's important that the pavement has to be that of limestone. Note the process of chemical weathering under carbonation. The rainwater plus carbon dioxide will form the mild carbonic acid. That mild carbonic acid will eat away or dissolve the rocks, then forming the joints or the cracks. Then note in the second diagram, the joints or the cracks get to be deepened and widened, resulting then in blocks or ridges left standing, and the gaps itself are referred to as the grikes, and those ridges or the blocks that are left standing are examples of clines. Okay, and that's the homework that you're supposed to have completed. You do your corrections and then we'll move on. Finally, today what I'd like us to look at will be the third and the last type of weathering. We have covered mechanical or physical weathering. We've looked at examples under physical and mechanical weathering. We have just also completed work now on chemical weathering, and we've looked at some examples which comes under chemical weathering. And our lesson today I would like us to look at the last type of weathering, and that is biological or biotic weathering. While we are going through the information on biological or biotic weathering, you should be able to pick up the fact that biotic weathering or biological weathering, sometimes it is actually not included as a process on its own, simply because the actions of plants and animals can either be physical or mechanical, or it can be chemical. So in some books, you will find that under the heading on weathering, they will only have chemical weathering and physical or mechanical. The reason why perhaps they do not have biological weathering on its own is already under physical or mechanical weathering and chemical weathering, the actions of plants and animals would come there. Say, for example, the tree root wedging and the burrowing actions of animals. They are examples of physical or mechanical. Even though they are to do with plants and animals, their actions are to do with stress and strain. Therefore, they are already classified as physical or mechanical. In chemical weathering, there are some plants and also some animals. They secrete maybe certain liquids, of which those liquids can also contribute to the breaking up of rocks. Where there is a chemical reaction that takes place as a result of the actions of plants and animals, then we can classify those type of weathering as chemical weathering. And that is the reason for why sometimes you will find in books physical and chemical weathering only mentioned and not so much of biotic weathering. But today we will look at biotic weathering, and it is important that you are also able to identify where we can place them in terms of the action, whether it is chemical or whether it is physical or mechanical. Okay, definition now given to what biotic or biological weathering is. It says, it is a type of weathering where you have a mixture of both physical and chemical weathering, but it is mainly caused by plants and animals. So when we're looking at biological, biotic, we're looking at mainly actions of plants and animals. So any type of weathering of which plants and animals are involved, we can consider the type of weathering as biotic or biological. Let's look at some of the examples that we've looked at already. Perhaps you have a photograph or a picture there showing the tree roots growing. This is also biological weathering, even though the action which is actually taken by this tree there when it is growing is considered physical or mechanical. But because the tree is a plant, it comes under also biological weathering. A second photograph showing, again, the tree or plant here growing into the rocks, resulting in the breaking up of rocks. This is considered, the action is considered to be a physical type weathering because of the stress and strain of the plant roots, resulting in the cracking of the rocks. But because this is to do with a plant, we can say this example is also a biological type weathering. On that particular photograph or picture, you can see a moss cover. Here we have mosses which are actually growing on the rocks, and those moss can also contribute to breaking up of the rock of which they are on. So the yellow, maybe color picture that you see there is of a moss. So the mosses are actually growing on top of the rock itself, and the mosses can contribute also to the breaking up of the rock. Okay, so you have a photograph there showing the moss on a rock. Okay, here's another example of lichens. Lichens are also examples of plants which actually grow on rocks. Those lichens there can also contribute to the breaking up of the rock on which they are growing on. The orange color and the yellowish color represents the lichens. So mosses and lichens growing on rocks can also contribute to their breaking up, and mosses and lichens are to do with plants and the plant action. When you look at that photograph, you would have noted that there is no physical type weathering taking place, because on that photograph you cannot see the stress and the strain of those lichens growing on rocks to have created the rocks to break up. So what type of weathering beside biotic do you think mosses and lichens can have also on rocks? It is chemical, yes. So maybe keep your eye on that particular example, and I'll go through the information so that we understand that photograph a little bit better, or that picture a little bit better. From that particular photograph, it is actually lichens which have been formed, and lichens, when they are formed from that photograph, it is a combination of two very primitive plants. And those two primitive plants are the fungi and algae. They live, from that photograph I'm making reference to now, they live together in order to help each other survive, the fungi and the algae. The fungi draws some substances or food from the rock minerals, and it provides moisture for the algae, which uses the sun to manufacture sugar or sugars upon which the fungi feeds. As the lichens spread, they help to break the surface of the rocks on which they grow into finer particles. They also produce a little humus or decomposing plant remains, which helped to develop a little soil and made it possible for other plants to grow. So here we are looking at an example also of chemical weathering, but because this is to do with lichens, it is biological or biotic. Okay, we move on. You have more lichens, especially in northern Alaska. Again, most of those, if they are growing on rocks, can contribute to the breaking up of rocks. But because they are to do with plants, we can consider them as biotic or biological weathering. Okay, those are lichens then in northern Alaska. So obviously by looking at that photograph, you can say the season would have been summer for such to actually grow, or for those plants to grow. Okay, beside the plants, which can contribute to the breaking up of rocks under biotic weathering, animals can also contribute to breaking up of rocks under biotic or biological weathering. The first example we looked at was under the heading on physical and mechanical weathering. And that's when we looked at the burrowing actions of animals. Some animals, they burrow, and while they're burrowing, they can also break up rocks through that process. That is adding stress and strain. Therefore, we classified burrowing action of animals as a physical or mechanical weathering. It tells us there from the information on the monitor, another type of biotic weathering is found also in coastal regions. Some animals which are known as limbfights. Limbfights, they secrete a type of acid of which, from the type of acid that they secrete, can attack the rocks on which they are on. Limbfights are shell-like creatures, and the shells grow in clusters on rocks, especially along coastlines. And those shells then, they secrete a certain type liquid of which that particular acid or liquid which is removed from them can attack the rocks, resulting in their breaking up. This is an example of an animal and how an animal can also contribute to chemical type weathering. The limbfights. Maybe those people who come from the coastal areas, you might have seen on jetties, perhaps the old jetties, the wharves or those bridges out to the sea. During low tide, you will see clusters of shells which collect on the side of the post, on the jetties or on the rocks during low tide, and then high tide, they get to be covered. The clusters of shells then can be referred to as limbfights, if they are definitely limbfights. So those limbfights then, over time, they secrete a type of acid, and that type of acid can contribute to the breaking up of rocks. Okay, so limbfights, an example of an animal found in coastal areas, which does also help in the breaking up of rocks. I do not have a photograph or a picture of a lympphite, but if I do get one, then I might be able to show you an example. Another of the perhaps animals we can say are bacteria. Bacteria in the presence of water can break down certain minerals in the soil also. We also note that all plants, they absorb minerals from the soil. Decaying vegetation also produces organic acids which cause a further breakdown of minerals. And those decaying vegetation can come in the form of humus. We collect leaves, and instead of burning those leaves, we are told that let's go and maybe make a pile, a compost heap, and then from that pile perhaps we can use that pile later on for fertilizer. So similarly, when we look at decaying vegetation, they can also produce organic acids, and those acids can be used to further break down minerals in rocks. So basically, we can say bacteria in the presence of water is an example of biotic or biological weathering. Decaying vegetation, as in humus, is also an example of biotic or biological weathering. Animal actions, say for example, lymphites, the burrowing actions of animals, tree root wedging, and also mosses and lichens are some examples of plants that can also contribute to the breaking down of rocks. And because biotic or biological weathering has to do with plants and animals, where plants and animals are actually involved, then we can say this type of weathering then is biotic or biological. Any queries or questions with what we have looked at on biotic or biological weathering? Questions? Okay, if there are no questions, perhaps from what I have explained, we are ready now to look at some activities, and those activities then will be in line with what we have looked at on biotic or biological weathering. The extra clipping that I have there is an example also of biological weathering. Again, the action might be physical or mechanical because of the burrowing action, but because it's to do with an animal, it comes under biotic or biological. Our friend the rabbit. Okay, 3 lots of activities for us to do now. The 3 activities, the first one, you're supposed to describe how plants and animals can assist in the breaking up of rocks. That's number 1. Number 2, vegetation cover on the surface of the earth provides shade. Plant roots retain moisture. How do you think these 2 characteristics of vegetation affect the weathering process? And number 3, how do plants make chemical weathering more effective? I'm going to give you at least 4 minutes for each of the activity. You can discuss with the person sitting next to you. You come up with the answers, but have your answers written in your exercise book. We'll start with the first activity. You have 4 minutes, and then I will switch to the second activity, another 4 minutes, and then to the third one. Okay, shall we correct those 3 exercises? Okay, we'll look at the correction now of the 3 activities. And we'll go to the first activity, which would like you to describe how plants and animals can assist in the breaking up of rocks. Any volunteer from the class to give the answer for the first activity? Volunteer from the class? No volunteer? Okay, Shelley at the back. Can you explain and describe how plants and animals can assist in the breaking up of rocks?
In plants, plants grow on rocks, and the roots may make their way further down into the rocks, thus causing the rock to break down. And for animals, take for instance the lymphites, secret type of acid which may attack the rock and causes it to break down, and the action of burrowing and true-root wedging also will take place.
Okay, very good. We're looking at the burrowing action, can contribute to the breakup of rocks. Tree root wedging can contribute to the breaking up of rocks. That's not all. We also have lymphites. She's given an example, which is an animal which secretes a certain acid which can contribute to the breaking up of rocks. And we also have the mosses and lichens, which do secrete a certain maybe acid that can contribute to the breaking up of rocks. We also have, we did look at the lymphites already, the burrowing action, tree root wedging, mosses and lichens. Humus, also in decaying vegetation, and bacteria in the presence of water. Those then are looking at how plants and animals can assist in the breaking up of rocks. So for all of those we have covered, you should be able to explain how they can contribute to the breaking up. Well done. We look at question 2. Doreen, will you be able to explain now question 2 or give us the answer for question 2? The question reads, vegetation cover on the surface of the earth provides shade. Plant roots retain moisture. Those are the two characteristics. And how do you think those two characteristics of vegetation affect the weathering process?
The shade slows down the process of weathering because the sun's heat is blocked by the leaves, where heat is not exerted on the rocks, which slows down the process. And retaining moisture, it speeds up the weathering process whereby the trees growing need more. The roots expand, causing cracks in the rocks.
Okay, very good. She's explained that well enough for us to understand. An example given on trees and the shade. The shade then does not allow direct hitting of the rocks or all those rocks which are under it. Therefore, the rate of breaking up is a little bit slower compared to those rocks that are lying exposed directly to the heat. For the plant root retaining moisture, it can also speed up the weathering process because when the roots are growing deep to look for water or moisture, they can contribute to the breaking up of the rocks. Okay, very good, well explained. And finally, the last question here, Val. Val is going to give us the answer for the last question. How do plants make chemical weathering more effective?
The decay of plant leaves creates humus, where rainwater. The decay of plants may create humus. When they come in contact with rainwater, they become more acid, speeding up the process of chemical weathering.
Okay, very good. It's mainly bacteria in the presence of water we're looking at, but because bacteria is to do with animals and our question would like to look at plants, it will be the decaying leaves or decaying vegetation mainly that we should have for the answer for exercise 3. The question again would like us to look at how do plants make chemical weathering more effective, and we'll have to look at the decaying vegetation where humus is actually produced, and from humus there are certain acids which are produced which can contribute to the breaking up of rocks. Okay, very good. That will also bring us to the end of our lesson, and basically what we have looked at today, we have looked at the third type of weathering, and that is biotic or biological. And be reminded again that we can also classify most of what we have looked at as examples of biotic or biological weathering under chemical or physical and mechanical. Okay, class, if you could stand up now, please. Okay, to the pilot teachers, our keyword for lesson 68 is biotic. Good afternoon and thank you, students.